Right now, we visit with Congressman Jodey Arrington here on the Chad Hasty Show. Congressman, welcome back. How are you?
God bless West Texas, Chad. I'm doing great. And before we say anything, I want to say, indulge me for just a second. Happy birthday to my wife. I love you. You're amazing. You're an incredible mom. You're my best friend. Thanks for letting me do what I'm doing now for the people of West Texas and fulfill a dream of mine since I was a kid. I love you. Happy birthday.
Very nice, Congressman. Well, happy birthday to her. Happy birthday. Absolutely. Congressman, I do appreciate you joining us today. There's not much going on in Washington these days. All seems pretty quiet up there, right?
Well, at least on the House side, I think we finally have some deflection over on to the Senate, which is troubling and unfortunate and sad. But all the actions on the Senate side. Yeah,
let's talk about your friends over on the Senate side. What's going on with this, the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation? To me, and again, I wasn't there. Obviously, other than Brett Kavanaugh and this accuser, they're the only ones who know, I think, the absolute truth. But this just seems to me to be the Democrat playbook and the Democrats trying to blow up this confirmation process because it totally goes outside the norm of Brett Kavanaugh, it seems.
Well, there's a lot of things that are disconcerting about it. I mean, number one, it seems very far afield from the character of Brett. I know him, but I wasn't there either, like you said. This is 36 years ago, and the courts are really the appropriate place, not the court of public opinion or a confirmation hearing for this to be sort of vetted and for the validity of any claim in this incident. I mean, look, we all condemn sexual misconduct. I don't know a person, Republican or Democrat, that doesn't. And as a father of a young girl, I take seriously any allegations of sexual misconduct. But I think, like a lot of Americans, the timing is suspect, and I have concerns about how this process is unfolded. For example, Senator Feinstein, she had this information. She had the information for weeks, and she didn't raise the flag to the committee. She never talked about it to Brett when he came to meet with her in private. And so, look, I think the Senate's doing the right thing to invite her to tell her story. But I think it's also appropriate to have Judge Kavanaugh tell his, because we have two allegations, one of sexual misconduct, the other of being falsely accused. And I think it's important that Judge Kavanaugh get to speak to that. Ultimately, I think, again, the criminal justice system was the appropriate venue to vet this thing out. Well, we need to move forward. And I think the stakes are high. Everybody knows this is the most important legacy item of this president and this Congress, and we need to move forward. And I completely reject the notion that I think Vice President Biden put out there, that we should presume that Judge Kavanaugh is guilty. He said we should presume that the essence of her story is true. But that's not the way the justice system works. That's not the way the Constitution was positioned for people who are accused of a crime. We are innocent until proven guilty. So I'm concerned across the board, and I think they should move forward and take a vote.
Is this the new normal in Washington, D.C., what we're seeing right now play out?
Sadly, I think it's gotten to the point that it's worse than it's ever been. But I got to say, I think this is going to play out poorly for the Democrats, because I think this one is just too obvious. And I think, for me, I'm old school, Chad. I mean, if the president of another party wins, if it were an Obama or whomever, I say let them pick their people as long as they have unimpeachable character. They have the right, because they were elected by the people, to put their folks in place and to advance their agenda. If the American people don't like the outcome of that agenda, they can vote a person of a different party with different ideas and different views. I mean, this is just getting ridiculous. I'm sure that things have happened with Republicans in the same, but right now I think these tactics are not going to play out well, and I think ultimately the American people, they're not dumb like politicians in Washington think they are. They have good judgment, good common sense, and I think that's going to play out in these elections.
Obviously, you're not on the committee, you're not in the Senate, but are you hearing anything as far as if she doesn't show up to testify, what the game plan is going to be next week for the Republicans?
Well, Grassley has said he's going to move forward, and I think the senators, at least on the Republican side, that have said we need to hit pause are now saying we need to move forward. So I feel like everything's going to move forward. He's going to get the vote. He's going to get the confirmation, and he's going to be the next Supreme Court justice. And he's going to take that swing vote from Kennedy, and he's going to make this solidly a majority of conservative constitutionalists, and that's as it should be, and our country will be better off.
All right, let's take a look on something that you are working on, and that is the Farm Bill. Obviously not getting any attention whatsoever by the national media, but it's something that people out here are paying attention to.
Well, they don't want to give it attention. Number one, they don't give enough value to the safety net and the stability of the ag economy and what farmers and ranchers do for this great country. Not just our economy, not just affordable and abundant, safe supply of food, but the national security of being able to feed and clothe our own people. But the big one, though, that the national press does not want to cover is the fact that Democrats don't want to include a work requirement of 20 hours a week of either work, training, or volunteer for able-bodied adults who are on food stamps. And I'm telling you, the majority of people in this country, citizens, voters, Republican and Democrat alike, the vast majority think that we ought to have accountability and that we ought to have work requirements for work-capable adults. So, of course, the national media doesn't want to cover that because that's another distinction between Republican leadership and our agenda versus the Democrats. They want to abolish ICE. They want open borders. They want universal care that we couldn't afford, and it would be a disaster. And they don't want work requirements for people who are receiving government assistance. They want people to make a lifestyle out of it. They want to trap people in a cycle of dependence on government. And it's sad. And I think that I'm glad you're asking the question at a local level, but the national media is nowhere to be found on this issue. That's still the big sticking point. And we still got to work through that. But our chairman Conaway is fighting hard to keep that component of welfare to work reform in the Farm Bill. I think the farm policy side is looking good and strong. I don't have any concerns about that. This is the sticking point. We just got to stay after it.
Well, and what's the timeline? Because the current Farm Bill is going to expire on September 30th, correct?
That's correct, and so you're right, the clock's ticking. I don't think there's been any movement, Chad. The chairman and ranking members of both House and Senate have been up here in Washington this week working through it. We could continue with the current Farm Bill through the end of the year. Then it gets really tricky after the year. So, I mean, we're still going to push to get it done, and I'm hopeful that we can get a compromise because the farmers and ranchers, especially in West Texas with the drought, really need this. And we restored cotton to the safety net, and they really need it because they've been living without it for the last 3 years. But look, with an economy growing, with 7 million surplus jobs, if we can't reform the welfare system and if we can't do something about food stamps and people who are taking and not contributing and are trapped, then we will miss. To me, then if we can't do it in this environment, I don't know when we'll ever do it. So I think we got to stay after it and get it right. That's the most important thing.
It sounds like to me y'all are pretty far apart right now, and that there's not a lot of movement.
Well, again, there were other issues in the Farm Bill, like, for example, some support for textile mills who would be put out of business by China. We used to do 80% of spinning our product from cotton to a product here in this country. Now we do 80% of that textile manufacturing in China. So there are things that we have worked out on the ag side. There's plenty to work through, but I don't see any problems. But you're right that there hasn't been any movement on the food stamp side, and that's concerning. But I don't want to just give up now. We do have a little more runway. We can kind of stretch this out through the end of the year if we have to. But ultimately, I'm going to be pushing for what's best for the farmers and ranchers of West Texas, and they're in a pretty much a crisis situation. So that's just where we are right now.
So what happens if we don't, September 30th comes and goes, we're going to, I guess, extend the current farm bill to the end of the year? What happens if we get to the end of the year and we don't have an agreement?
Well, that gets really tricky, and I think that becomes a much more complicated situation. I mean, it's not as complicated if you can continue under 14. It's not ideal. We need a new farm bill. I don't see any scenario where we go beyond the end of the year. I think that's a drop-dead date. But again, the guys, producers in our region and throughout the country, they need help now with the trade inequities, with the commodity prices being so low, with the trade deals sort of hanging in the balance. So there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, and we need to work to solve it as soon as we can. Again, we've got one shot at what represents 85% of the farm bill and $70 billion a year, and that's the food stamp program. I sure would hate to miss the opportunity to get some reforms in place, and we're trying to push as hard as we can on it. At some point, we've got to help these farmers, because this farm bill and the safety net in the farm bill is a lifeline to the lifeblood of West Texas, and that's agriculture.
Congressman, we've got to take the break. When we come back, we're going to talk about tax reform and a couple of other issues. Appreciate you staying on hold with us. When we come back, we'll continue our visit with Congressman Jodey Arrington here on the Chad Hasty Show. Chad Hasty Show, News Talk KFYO. We continue our conversation with Congressman Jodey Arrington here on the show. And Congressman, appreciate you joining us. There's been a little bit of talk about what's been called Tax Cut 2.0. Talk to us a little bit about that and what we might be looking at either before or after the midterms.
Well, unfortunately, this is my first term, and I'm experiencing a midterm election as a member of Congress for the first time. I'm a Texas Tech Red Raider. I believe the best defense is a good offense, so I keep driving on this agenda, but I think too often people just say, look, we've got to not do anything and not take any risks. I do think we need to be in our district selling what we've accomplished, and I think it's significant. But we do have, had historic tax reform. We've got a simplified code. We've got cuts for middle class and working families. We've seen this economy grow like we haven't seen in recent history. Wages and income are up. And now what we want to do is make the individual and family and small business cuts permanent. And if we do that, we'll see an additional 2% GDP on top of the 4% that we're seeing now, which is twice what it was under Barack Obama and Obamonomics and big government. We'd also see more money in the pockets of our fellow Americans. And we encourage more savings in this 2.0. We also encourage more startup company. We're allowing them to write off more of their sort of seed investment, their initial capital investment. That'll encourage more entrepreneurs to start companies and create more jobs and grow this economy even more. So, look, free market, pro-growth policies of President Trump and this Republican Congress are working. And at the end of the day, people have to ask themselves when they go to the voting booth, am I better off today than I was over the last 10 years under Democrat control and under the Democrat big government agenda? The answer, I think, overwhelmingly is going to be yes. And that's a good thing because we got a lot more to do.
Your colleague, Representative Kevin Brady, according to CNBC, says he doesn't think he can get through the entire Senate and House before the midterm elections. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. That's kind of the reference to people sort of not wanting to take any risks during the midterm elections. I think you've got some folks in Republicans in the New York and other states where they have high cost of personal property, and the sort of SALT provision gets brought up, and that's the local and state property tax issue that they used to be able to deduct, and now they just have a $10,000 cap. So it affects them, and I think they have to go back and explain why they voted for the tax reform when it hurt their state, quote unquote. But I think folks in Texas and places in Middle America are tired of subsidizing New York and other places, and we did the right thing. But those are the dynamics politically that I think the majority sort of leadership is having to figure out. And then you've got the 60 vote in the Senate. So I like teeing it up because I think we need to challenge the Democrats to put their money where their mouth is. They've said, a lot of them said they wouldn't vote for the last tax reform because it didn't make permanent the individual and small business tax cuts. It did on the corporate side. So I think we ought to see if they'll come in with us. And if they don't, then they have to explain back home in their districts, in their states, why they don't support making permanent the tax cuts for the individuals and families.
Visiting with Congressman Jodey Arrington, there seems to be another part of this that I don't hear a lot of Republicans talking about, and that is cutting spending. We used to hear a lot about that when President Obama was in office, that we need to cut spending, and that we need to tackle the debt at some point. Is there any type of discussion about that among Republicans right now about cutting spending anywhere?
I'm glad you brought it up. I'm going to tell you, it's my biggest frustration with being up here. I've said all along the long-term biggest threat to our kids' and grandkids' future in this country is a sovereign debt crisis, and it's not dealing with our $21 trillion debt. We're now at $1 trillion annual deficit. What does that mean? It means that in less than 10 years, we're going to spend more on the interest on our debt than on all of national defense. It is a looming crisis that if we don't deal with it, it's going to marginalize this country. We're going to see taxes go through the roof. Our economy is going to be terrible, and we won't have the money for a great defense, for a good farm bill, for good infrastructure. It affects everything. So I feel like, look, I'm on the budget committee. We've passed balanced budgets twice. We passed some of the deepest cuts in spending, especially on the mandatory side, because that makes up 70% of the entire budget is spending that's on autopilot, and that's really what's driving the debt. We did that twice, and it went nowhere. One got out of the House, but failed in the Senate. The other hasn't even gotten out of the House.
Yeah. We need to work on your colleagues then, Congressman. Hey, I appreciate your time, and we'll visit with you down the road.
God bless. Go West Texas.